Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events and personalities from around the world. This episode is the first of a series on The Lead, which we're calling The American Experiment. It's an opportunity to interrogate and think through some of the themes, ideas, even controversies that will become apparent in the second term of a Donald Trump presidency. Hari Kunzru is a British novelist and commentator whose work straddles the Atlantic and themes of globalization, capitalism, identity, and race. His most recent novel, Blue Ruin, features a protagonist whose life and career, like Kunzru's, has spanned the Atlantic. Jay, a once up-and-coming young British conceptual artist, is now an undocumented immigrant in the United States, living out of his car in New York, where he has become disillusioned with the highly commercialized art scene, but has also been forgotten by it. The novel makes up the third in Kunzru's trilogy that was started with White Tears, followed by Red Pill. Although the novels are only loosely connected, the Financial Times notes the trilogy, quote, presents a panoramic portrait of the social, moral, and aesthetic crises besieging contemporary America. Kunzru also writes as a journalist and commentator, frequently contributing to the New York Review of Books, and has also contributed a new introduction to the Edward Said classic Culture and Imperialism, which is due to be re-released by Penguin later this month. He joins us today to discuss last week's astonishing election, the broader cultural and political state of his new home, the United States, and the echoes of Trumpism across the Atlantic. Hari Kunzru, welcome to The Lead.
Very happy to be here.
You said to me just before we started that you've been living in the US now for 16 years.
Yes, that's really crept up on me, actually. I mean, I realised that when I left, Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister.
Right, the last Labour government.
Yes, and so I've actually been here long enough for the UK to have really shifted since I was last there full time.
Ah. And the US has shifted quite a lot in that period, I imagine.
Enormously. I was in the US for the first Barack Obama election win. In fact, I went up to Harlem that night and witnessed this kind of extraordinary outpouring of joy that was way over and above anything to do with a specific candidate. It was a kind of sense of a long chapter of American history closing, really. And, little did we know that the backlash would be so severe and that its orange avatar would be currently the president-elect.
Is that how you interpret this most recent election, as the long tail of the Obama presidency?
I mean, when I'm being flippant, I sometimes say that if Obama hadn't made a joke about President Trump and dropped the mic at the White House Correspondents' Dinner all those years ago, we would have a completely different contemporary American history. Yeah. I mean, that's obviously slightly too flip, but there is a sense in which Trump represents a kind of backlash against the gains that non-white people have made since the Civil Rights Act in the 60s and the end of the restrictions on Asian immigration and so on. I mean, we're on our way to the USA being a majority non-white country, and that is profoundly destabilizing for people who have felt that it was a white Christian nation in destiny or in its leadership.
I mean, I think the interesting part about that, even if we accept the premise of it, that the jokes at the White House Correspondents' Dinner led to Trump going in, even if you accept that, he was certainly tapping into a much wider belief, which you could trace to the end of the Obama years, and this is something I think we'll come to later, this belief in the United States that it was very unusual among certain demographics to have a black man as president.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, race is an important aspect of this, but I think one of the things that some commentators are finding hard to get their arms around about the recent result is the enormous gains that Trump has made with people of color. A lot of Latino people voted for Trump. A lot of black voters voted for Trump. And, I think we have to understand this in terms of social conservatism as well as anything straightforwardly to do with race. I've heard it theorized that perhaps the cohort of black voters who were considered by the Democratic Party to be always part of their coalition because they had such a direct memory of what America was like before the Civil Rights Act, they've now aged out, and younger black people don't feel so automatically that they have to look only to the Democratic Party for political possibilities. You know, there's a lot of social conservatism in immigrant communities as well, and that played a part in choosing Trump over Harris.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I particularly wanted to talk to you about because I think it's something that straddles the Atlantic. I mean, the social conservatism, we talked briefly about how America will be majority non-white in perhaps a couple of decades. But that doesn't mean that we can, even if that is true, it doesn't mean that we can predict the politics of the country. Because as you've just outlined, black people voted for Trump, they pushed right, Latinos voted for Trump, they pushed right. This conservatism seems to straddle different demographics. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with race and color and even religion.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the ironies of the Republican Party's obsession with closing the border is that, as some Mexican friends of mine recently pointed out to me, a lot of the people coming north from Central America are in fact, recently converted evangelicals who would, instead of, there's this conspiracy theory that the Democrats are importing a new electorate in order to lock in Democratic Party control. And in fact, actually, a lot of the undocumented new immigrants from Central America are evangelicals and would much more naturally form part of a social conservative base for the Republicans.
Yeah, some of the people who are coming in, they are motivated by religion, so religion is very important to them. They naturally have what you might think of as an inherently conservative belief in trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, move to a new country, which isn't a small thing. It's a very difficult, complicated thing to do. And then on top of that, some of them are fleeing governments which are very left-wing. And so if you add those three parts of it together, it's very likely that they are going to shift right.
Yeah, I mean, there's for several generations, there's been this highly conservative Cuban contingent in U.S. politics. You find it especially in Miami and the south of Florida, people who lost out in the Cuban Revolution, and they've always been solidly conservative. And to them now, you have to add the Venezuelans who are coming as refugees from the economic collapse of Venezuela under Chavismo.
Do you think then that you can make predictions about what the country might be like politically, even if, as we were saying earlier, it does sort of move in the direction of being non-white?
No, I don't think so at all. I think there are so many unknowns right now. I mean, this really is an extraordinarily complicated situation. And, we're virtually at the stage of having to kind of parse different appointments to see what kind of policy directions the new government might go in. I mean, for example, as we're speaking, the most recent announcement is that Marco Rubio will be the Secretary of State, which has raised a lot of eyebrows since Rubio's foreign policy positions are much more in line with the traditional kind of Republican neocon positions. And one of the promises of the incoming Trump administration was the sort of more nationalist America First positions. Yeah. They've positioned themselves as an alternative to a kind of neoliberalism that that they felt has entangled the US in various foreign wars. I think one of the real realignments going on in US politics is that there's you could call it an old neoliberal center, which is equally Democratic Party and Republican Party, which has kind of coalesced around a sort of Harris centrism, this decision that Harris made to campaign with Liz Cheney. Yeah. And that has alienated people on both sides. There's a right and a left that feels for different reasons that they're deeply hostile to this neoliberal establishment. And it's an establishment which can float in between the two-party structures. So it'll be very, very interesting to see where that kind of politics finds its home in the future, whether it's actually going to end up, I mean, certainly as it is now, I mean, I feel that the elite of the Democratic Party are very identified with that kind of 90s neoliberal politics, and they have kept the left of the Democrats very, very far away from this campaign. perhaps to their detriment, for people who wanted change, people who wanted to see some kind of acknowledgement of economic issues and of a need to change foreign policy direction. It was clear that the Harris campaign didn't represent that, whereas the Trump campaign, with its right-wing nationalism, has perhaps captured that spirit more fully.
Yeah, it feels like it's a repudiation of almost the entirety of the Democratic and Republican establishment. That Trumpism represents something ideologically very different. Because, Harris, as you mentioned with Dick Cheney, Harris made it a point to try to get as many Republicans on her side as possible, to present this view that she was the candidate that would be the most normal, the most natural governing party. And then when you have such a repudiation of that, it's very hard not to see it as the beginning of something different, something politically new.
I think that's true. We may be looking at the very end of the arc of neoliberalism that started with the Clintons, went through Obama, and has run properly off the road with Harris.
Do you think that sometimes when we are thinking about American politics, we, especially in the Trump era, that we focus too much on the personality of the man and not on the ideologies that he might be, let's say, surfing on, the waves of ideology that he's surfing on top of?
I think that's a complicated question, because there are some things that are associated particularly with Trump. He has a sort of family and corporate structure around him, and is fairly explicit in that he uses the presidency to enrich himself. He uses his political campaigning to enrich himself. There are various uninvestigated stories about where campaign donations have gone, and the kind of fuzzy boundaries between personal money and campaign money. And as you know, the RNC, the national party machinery, is now under the control of the Trump family through Lara Trump. So there is a highly personalized aspect to this. But apart from Trump the man and Trump the organization, yes, I would agree that there is a new right, a new nationalist right that is, in some ways a creature of the internet. I feel like I've watched a lot of these people come up in the last 20 years and make their way out of the fringes, out of the chans and the message boards into positions of power. And you'd point to figures like Vance and Stephen Miller, the new deputy chief of staff, as absolutely creatures of an online right, which was once known as the alt-right, but is now, I would say, nothing alternative about it, that it represents quite a major current in American politics. And it's economically nationalist. It is fairly, it combines the complicated coalition they have is that they do combine a kind of conservative religious nationalism with a kind of tech utopianism, in some cases almost a kind of transhumanist utopianism that you could say is represented by Elon Musk and the new Silicon Valley libertarian right. And, much in the way that the old conservative coalition between evangelicals and the sort of business elite was a big tent under which Republican Party politics proceeded basically since the 60s, since the Civil Rights Act. This is a new coalition which kind of incorporates tech utopians and social conservatives and trads of various kinds. So the Mormon trad wife influencer finds herself on the same side as the tech bro who's trying to live to 200.
Yeah, that's very intriguing about the techno-futurism and these tech bros, because some of the techno thinking of Silicon Valley has definitely infected politics. But it's given politics, on the one hand, it's given them this idea of data first, data-led decisions, which is good. It takes away some of the political instincts, which sometimes don't adequately reflect countries on the scale of the UK or scale of the US. But on the other hand, it kind of takes the human out of the equation.
Well, a couple of things to say about that. I mean, firstly, the ambition to take certain things out of the realm of politics goes right back into the interwar period in the early 20th century. You know, neoliberalism, as it was initially formulated between the wars, and I have to say that the historian Quinn Slobodian is very good on this, and my ideas about this are very much indebted to him. The ambition of neoliberalism was initially to take certain kinds of decision-making out of the ideological hurly-burly of politics, that certain things were too technical, certain things needed longer time horizons. And so the idea of economic decision-making and economic planning in particular being left to a sort of cadre of elites was seen as a pragmatic way of bypassing the ideological polarization of the 30s in Europe, say.
Right.
So the idea of something being data driven is always to say it's not driven by passions, it's not driven by prejudice. It has a pleasingly objective sheen to it.
Yeah.
Which I'm all for evidence-based policy. I mean, I think that's clearly a good thing, but at the same time, there's the idea that that's objective in a pure way it's very important to interrogate that, and there are clearly limits to the notion that the wisdom of market technocrats is somehow not ideological and not self-serving.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect to the kind of Silicon Valley, the kind of it's a kind of solutionism is one thing I've heard it called. That you treat politics like you would an engineering problem, and
exactly.
and that has its advantages, but also it has its huge ideological blind spots. But then there's a much more kind of extravagant ideological vision, which is quite kind of complicated to unwrap at the moment, but which is associated with ideas like Musk wants us to, as he says, to become an interplanetary species. The imperative should be to finance various kinds of space exploration, and to kind of, this gets very wrapped up with eugenics, this gets wrapped up with transhumanism, and with the current tech obsession with the birth rate, which is particularly fascinating. The new figures coming up. Gone are the days of the population bomb and the idea that there's going to be this sort of infinitely accelerating kind of curve, but actually it looks like we're going to top out at about 8 billion, and that as far as some of these tech guys are concerned, it's not the correct people who are having children. One of the ways politics has really shifted in the last 20 years is that it's become respectable again to talk about eugenics, and the idea of high IQ people are not having enough children while low IQ people are having too many children is definitely something that's part of conversation there, along with all the issues that comes with, all the baggage of the last century that comes with.
Do you detect some of that eugenics talk in the idea of leaving the planet? Because it's a particular type of person that will leave the planet, and if this planet isn't working well, maybe the elites can just go somewhere else and start a perfect civilization.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a vision that Jeff Bezos has promoted in recent times, that the way to save the environment of the Earth is to move the vast majority of the population off planet, to rewild the Earth and have it as a kind of national park for the rich to play in. Then there's a slightly different vision, which is associated with the tendency known as effective altruism, which is very rooted in the UK, actually, in a sort of Oxford philosophical tradition, where a sort of utilitarian philosophical tradition, where there's a kind of almost like a sort of crude numerological aspect to it, that the more people there are living happy lives, the greater is the sum total of happiness, and therefore the more good there is. And in this vision, we go off the planet, we multiply in exponential ways, and in the future there are trillions of potentially happy human existences, or perhaps even intelligent existences that aren't based on biological humans, and the sheer sort of numerical value of all this happiness and this potential happiness should outweigh any moral considerations about the precautionary principle or anything other than pure accelerationism is in some way immoral according to that. So we've got some very strange, quite new ideological tendencies which are which are kind of adding a sort of biological field into the mix in a way that it really hasn't been around since the middle of the last century.
Yeah, and the intriguing part of this, I think, is that it's actually these new figures on the right, even further on the right, who are actually saying some of this. So, for example, it strikes me that in the last few years, the people who have talked about the idea that GDP, endless growth, endless progress may not be the best thing are figures on the right. That Trump, people like Nigel Farage in the UK, they talk about the idea of quality of life in a way that I hadn't heard the mainstream talk about it, because there's been this, as you say, this kind of neoliberal focus on the idea of just constant increase in GDP, and that will somehow solve all of the related problems.
Yeah, I guess it's quality of life for who is the political question. And, one thing I've been worried about for a long time is the way that climate politics are a vector for a certain kind of security-focused nationalism. If the idea is that we can't make a livable planet for everybody, then we have high walls and borders and drones keeping the pristine interior away from the swarming, infected exterior. This is an old vision. There's a kind of climate nationalism that I think is at play now, and things about quality of life can play into that notion.
You mentioned on a podcast prior to the election that part of what you called the libidinal appeal of Donald Trump is the chance to transgress and punish your enemies. And it was the opportunity, you said, to smash up the hegemony of the coastal elite. I imagine that you feel that that aspect of your analysis has now been vindicated by the election result.
Yeah, I think that's clearly what a lot of people have voted for. If you say that Trump is obscene, that's not just a cheap insult, that there is this idea of obscenity as transgression, of saying the thing that the other person can't say, of calling your opponent the C word on a platform, of saying that you could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue. Trump is a sort of permission structure. I think that's one way of understanding his appeal, is that he allows the expression, either in imagination or fact, of all sorts of transgressive desires that the Momala, as she allowed herself to be referred to, if Mom is the one who's telling you not to shout so loudly and go and clean your room, and Donald is the one saying come out and rev your engine loudly and shoot guns, then there is, I think, in that key to understanding certainly Trump's appeal amongst young men. Women politicians have a fairly difficult needle to thread, in they often, particularly in the US, which has never had a female leader, the notion of the mother as nurturer and so on is deployed, especially in this kind of quite religious population that we have here, to kind of validate a female authority. But unfortunately, in this particular dynamic, you've got obscene dad versus hectoring mom.
Exactly.
One seems much more fun than the other to a lot of people.
It took $1.5 billion to work it out, to work through it on a sort of mass psychology level. But before we leave this topic, because I want to talk about your novel, but before we leave this topic, I wanted to ask you, because we talked about this is the election as an opportunity to smash up the hegemony of the coastal elite. I mean, you are part of that coastal elite. And I wonder if you think...
Well, I try.
Well, but isn't that interesting, Hari, that you don't see that as an insult? And I'm not suggesting that it is, but that some of the people on the Trump side would absolutely see it as an insult.
I mean, we're so far into this dynamic in American politics that it's absurd to pretend it doesn't exist. In a certain sense, it's an absolutely fake construction. I mean, most of the people you see on the screen condemning the coastal elites in the name of the ordinary blue-collar working man themselves have sort of 7 or 8 figure incomes
right, exactly,
annually.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, it's nonsense on one level. It's tech titans bashing, middle-class journalists.
Yes, I mean, not sorry to cut you off, but I mean that is an intriguing point about the people who campaigned for Trump and who surround him. The Vivek Ramaswamy's, millionaire, Elon Musk, obviously richest man in the world. These sorts of people are the people who are not only surrounding Trump, supporting Trump, but may actually serve him in government.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most intriguing dynamic of the incoming administration will be Trump and Musk. I think it's highly unstable. I mean, I think there's every chance that those guys will last 6 months as friends, and then Musk will take his ball elsewhere. But Musk is also kind of embedded in the national security state in complicated ways. Obviously, we've seen how he uses Starlink and so on. And there are other figures around, like, I mean, I think of Palmer Luckey, who's the former head of the Oculus VR system, who's now made a very successful defense tech company called Anduril, and they're beginning to win government contracts and to use sort of Silicon Valley workflow techniques to disrupt the very sclerotic defense tech industry. Of course, we're familiar with Peter Thiel and Palantir, and so there are ways in which Silicon Valley now is part of the defense establishment, but Musk as a personality is as mercuric as Trump, and he's also got a notoriously short attention span. And so, I mean, we'll see how that goes, but there's something very intriguing happening there, and it is the constitution of a new center of power. Silicon Valley historically hasn't been so interested in Washington politics except as it concerns regulation. But now there are people who seem to have decided that it's very good to pick a fight with this poorly defined East Coast, liberal intellectual class that it sees as resting on its laurels, or it sees as complacent. And I think for all of us involved, that's going to be a dialectic that produces some kind of new set of terms and conditions in the next decade or so.
Let's talk about your novel. The main character of your most recent part of this trilogy is called Jay in the novel Blue Ruin. And in so many ways, he's an outsider to the American world that he has now come to inhabit. He's someone that in the novel complains of having been chased by feral strangers who tried to throw me off a bridge. Does his experience in the novel typify your feelings about the outsider in the modern United States? That it's a hostile place for some people, and that it differs from the American dream in many ways?
Yeah, I think that's right. No, I mean, it's something that I think, as somebody who firstly came from the UK and secondly grew up at a point where there were, let's say, the threadbare remains of a particular kind of post-war social democracy was still held up as the ideal set of social arrangements. Coming to the US and realizing that the absence of safety net is so defining of all experience here, that was a real shock to me, and it took me a while to understand the implications of that, just in the most practical ways. This is the health insurance system here means that it's very, very hard for poor people to access even basic medical care. And that is a extremely powerful tool of social discipline for people who want to kind of retain access to medical care. That there's a huge invisible population here that is marginal kind of geographically, culturally, and so on. And I mean, in the past, I've often I remember in my second novel, Transmission, I used the image of just a person walking in suburban California. Just somebody who is walking by the side of the road is automatically a figure of fear and suspicion because of the way space is organized and because of the way that it seems to signify a kind of dangerous marginality. You're either mentally ill or you're homeless, or at best you're jogging. But I've always been interested in the way that operates here, and also a kind of mobility. This is famously the society where you pick up and you move further west if you want to change your life, and the kind of insecure marginal lives that are lived around the edges of America are clearly give the lie to the notion of a universally shared American dream of white picket fence prosperity.
You talked a bit about the the aspect of social control that having to have health insurance inflicts on the population. Have you thought about the way that social control is inflicted on the European or the British population? It's a different method of social control.
Yeah, I mean, the terms and conditions are different. I mean, British political life has, to a great extent, always relied on the notion of a shared experience and the idea that a powerful, quite centralised state would have legitimacy because it would give certain kinds of security to its people. I think in my lifetime, post-Thatcherism, really that contract is very much seeming quite threadbare in that the control aspects are still in place, but the social safety net, is not. And and so when social unrest arises in Britain with the last round of race riots, or kind of before that, the so-called kind of shopping riots in various cities in, I think it was 2011, that appears as a sort of huge surprise and a shock, but I think should be seen as a symptom of quite how disconnected from that particular social ideal a lot of people in Britain are.
Do you, when you were thinking about the reasons for Jay going to the US and you going to the US, did you find that they overlapped in some ways?
I mean, I shouldn't claim to have a more kind of worked out reason for being here than I actually do. I came here partly because of opportunities in my field. I came to do a residency back in 2008, and then I never went home again. Yeah. But the reason I never went home again wasn't because I was sort of straightforwardly in love with America. It was because I met somebody and fell in love and ended up having children. But also, New York is a good place for a writer, and it has offered me opportunities that I think I wouldn't have had in the UK. But at the same time, it's complicated. I mean, I've ended up writing about American things in an American idiom in some ways, and there are just on very straightforward levels, there are differences in language. There are words that don't make sense to people here that make sense to people in the UK. I mean, Jay is somebody who has a much more kind of, I suppose, conceptually rigorous thing that he's doing. He's an artist in London who becomes disillusioned with the terms and conditions of the art market and the way that art objects circulate as a sort of asset class, I suppose you'd say. And he doesn't want to participate in that. So he starts making work that's sort of less and less material, less and less commodifiable, until he decides that the most interesting thing that he can do is to sort of stage his own disappearance, to be absent in a performative way from the art world. And what happens to him is that once he's disconnected himself from the art scene as such, and he starts to travel around and living, has a sort of peripatetic period of his life, it becomes less and less clear to him how to get back, or to whether his movements are still part of the performance that he started by leaving, by becoming absent. And so, when he ends up in the US and he is living undocumented and he's doing various kinds of gig jobs, manual labor of various kinds, the question in the novel is in some sense he's still an artist? Is this still part of a performance, in the tradition of one of these long durational performances that various artists have conducted, or is he just somebody who used to be an artist and who is now a seasonal labourer or a gig worker? And those kind of, that sort of boundary area is something that interests me a lot. And and I think the traditional American notion of self-reinvention is something I've always been very interested in and written about in various ways.
And the self-perception as well. I mean, the change from being an artist to being a day labourer is it changes your perception of yourself and where you think you fit into the world.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you know all these kind of immaterial things about status and about the value of your work and a kind of additional sort of supplement of meaning that comes with the status of being an artist, all that I think is completely fascinating for various reasons. Partly because it also illuminates a lot of our feelings about identity and about the valorization of creative work. The figure of the creative in our culture has a particular kind of resonance. Creativity is a sort of secularized idea of soulfulness, really. There's religion hovering in the background of all of this as well. And a lot of the ways we think of artists are quasi-religious ways. And this kind of story allowed me a lot of leeway to kind of prod and poke at a lot of these different ideas.
I was trying to think of how to put Blue Ruin into the trilogy. And these are, for the audience, these are these three loosely connected three colours novels, which is, in reverse order, Blue Ruin, Red Pill and White Tears. But all of them, it seemed to me, have this male narrator protagonist who experiences some kind of breakdown or this sense of becoming unmoored, which is actually how the narrator of Red Pill puts it. I wondered if that was one way to connect the three, if that was an experience that you felt was a dominant theme of the three novels.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I mean, each of these three novels has a different kind of creative practice at the centre, or an artistic practice at the centre of it. White Tears is about a couple of young record producers who fake a 1920s blues record, and it becomes a sort of ghost story about cultural appropriation and about history there. Red Pill is about a rather grumpy non-fiction writer who goes to Berlin on a residency and becomes unmoored. It becomes realizes that many of the assumptions that he has about his life don't hold. You know, that was written and it becomes very much about the trauma of certain liberals in the mid 2010s faced with the rise of the new right, and the realization that certain things that they thought were sort of universally agreed on and held actually turned out not to be like that. So there's the musicians, there's the writer, and now there's an artist there are a group of artists who are in this third novel, Blue Ruin, who are dealing with what art means, what it means to be making commodities or not be making commodities, whether there's anything special or unique about the artist, and whether in some ways contemporary art is colluding with, call it the Davos class, the sort of upper echelons of global capital.
Yeah. I want to shift gears because I really want us to talk about your new introduction to the Edward Said book.
Sure.
I think we'll come back to some of the political ideas of recent American history, but I don't want us to. I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want us to lose this conversation, which I think is really intriguing. So you wrote the new introduction to cultural imperialism, and this is a classic work by the Palestinian intellectual and writer Edward Said. In that introduction, you highlight Said's theory of contrapuntality. Now, this is his view that when you are trying to interrogate, I mean, you can explain it better than I can, but let me offer a brief overview for the audience, and let's see if I've understood it properly. This is the view that when you are trying to interrogate literature, you also have to think about the counterfactual experience, which may be absent from the book itself. In other words, if you are trying to think about the experiences of the characters, you sometimes have to think about the experiences of the characters who are off stage.
Yeah, I think that's a very good, succinct summary. I mean, Said was a lover of classical music, so the kind of the idea of counterpoint it's something less than a dialectic, I think, is one way of thinking about it. We can also talk about Said's particular politics in that he rejected a kind of Marxist left in favour of what he hoped was a sort of more expansive liberalism. And the idea of a contrapuntal reading of a text is exactly as you say, that you have to be attentive to the silences, you have to be attentive to what the text is opposing itself to in some way. In Culture and Imperialism, Said decided to look at novels, which because he felt that the novel was the kind of paradigmatic cultural object for the period that involved the rise of colonialism. And the reading that people often come back to is talking about Jane Austen. Jane Austen's usually thought of as somebody who has quite a narrow focus on the mores and sort of marriage prospects of young women in this particular stratum of sort of upper middle class England. But Said says, well, what are the silences here? One of the silences is, where is the source of the money? Where is the source of the grandeur of the great houses to which these young ladies aspire to be married into? And one of those sources is slavery, it's sugar, it's the Caribbean trade. And so in a certain way, the gentility of the Jane Austen family depends on this sort of disavowed barbarism that would be the transatlantic slave trade. And in the introduction...
which happens completely off stage.
Yes, exactly. And that's that, it's one of these things. It's a kind of dark matter, you could say, in the sort of moral universe of these books.
I imagine when you were writing the introduction, you were thinking about the totality of the book. I imagine that you found a lot of reasons to find it relevant for the modern political moment.
Well, I mean, one of the extraordinary things is kind of revisiting what Said meant, say, during the 1980s in terms of how the Palestinian struggle was understood, especially here in the US. He taught at Columbia. He was a New York intellectual, and he's an incredibly urbane man who was actually a Protestant Christian. He comes from a Protestant tradition of Palestinian Christianity, and yet he was still monstered by political opponents. There was an infamous headline in one of the right-wing news monthlies calling him the Professor of Terror, and his attempt to actually have any kind of conversation about Palestine, about Zionism, and about the history of the region post-1948 was met with unbelievable derision and opposition. And yet from the perspective now, I mean, he seems like a very unlikely person to be a boogeyman, this sort of urbane New Yorker in his tailored suits listening to Beethoven. And so we see how far the conversation has come. We see the ways that even the most kind of reasonable avatars of the Palestinian cause was demonized as a terrorist. And then we look at the kind of things that have been happening, let's say, particularly on the Columbia campus here. A lot of things become visible about the structures of power and about the policing of speech in this supposedly free speech loving place. They talk about the Palestine exception to free speech, and we've had that demonstrated in spades, particularly for those of us who work in the education system. I'm a professor at NYU, and NYU has absolutely bumped up against the limits of that in recent months.
And I think also the book has something to say about nationalism and some of the themes that we talked about earlier about the MAGA movement. You note in the introduction that Said understood what the theorist Frantz Fanon called the pitfalls of national consciousness. And you situate that in the context of the 20th century anti-imperial movement, noting that, quote, unless national consciousness at its moment of success was somehow changed into a social consciousness, the future would not hold liberation, but an extension of imperialism. When you think about those nationalist movements of the 20th century, how do you think they compare with what we are seeing now, right now, in terms of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement?
Well, I mean, I think Said was specifically talking about the formation of new post-colonial elites, and in the period of decolonization, a kind of emergent national consciousness was a political tool around which opposition to colonizers could be organized. What Said was warning about, and what from a slightly retrospective view he was looking back and having seen in the period from roughly the end of the Second World War onwards, was that some of these national movements had then thrown up rather sort of venal national elites who had enriched themselves at the expense of lifting up their their countries. And, there's always been a lot of debate about where blame should lie for that kind of things. Were the terms and conditions so stacked against new post-colonial nations that they were never going to get free, where they were always going to be suborned by the oil companies and by the departing colonial powers? I mean, you look at what happened in Belgian Congo, you look at the CIA having its fingers in politics in places like Iran and Guatemala. But Said couldn't ignore the evidence of his eyes that there was a great deal of corruption, and that there was that many of these movements had fallen away from the lofty ideals of internationalism and non-alignment. I've noticed lately, actually, quite a lot of people seem to be revisiting the kind of Bandung moment of non-alignment, and looking at that and try to see whether in a sort of a newly multipolar world, maybe there are political possibilities and lessons for us there. The Trumpian nationalism obviously isn't a post-colonial nationalism. It's in a way it has a particular American pedigree of nativism, which has always been part of American politics. The various kinds of reassertions of Anglo dominance against new immigrant populations. Back in the day, the worry was Irish people, or was Germans even, or Italians. Slightly later, Jewish immigrants from the Palo settlement, and then Asians and Muslims and so on and so forth. And Trump, Trump is a kind of Jacksonian in that way, is as a sort of populist leader. He taps into this history of white nativism, and he's a deeply corrupt figure financially and morally as well. So perhaps he is repeating this kind of dynamic of promising national renewal and actually just lining his pockets.
I wanted to ask you something about Jane Austen. You mentioned Jane Austen, and you've said in the past that sometimes you fall prey to these Jane Austen moments where this was a quote from you, that you just can't stand the thought of anything futuristic and you'd go off and read an 18th or 19th century book. And I was thinking about that in the context of cultural imperialism. And I wondered if maybe coastal elites like yourself have been guilty over the past decades of maybe having an extended Jane Austen moment, focusing on beauty and the aesthetic splendor and ignoring the suffering of those who are kind of off stage.
I mean, I think there's plenty of ignoring suffering to go around, and it's not just liberal intellectuals. But I mean, I think that there is definitely a history of ignoring some of the new political movements, and particularly technological change. I mean, certainly here, lawmakers are amongst the least technologically savvy people around, and so you end up with this very toxic dynamic of the people who can barely switch their computers on or know how to work their phones are the ones who are being tasked with regulating enormously complicated new technologies like AI. And so it's pretty understandable that people who know more about that and are perhaps involved with those technologies and looking to them to, as very exciting vectors for the future, get extremely irritated at what they see as out of touch incumbents who are blocking progress. So we have a growing gulf between a particular wing of Silicon Valley, I think, a kind of libertarian and quite increasingly politicized wing of Silicon Valley that sees government as the problem and that sees, has no reason to respect the people who are supposed to regulate them, and other people who are looking to government as the traditional tool to protect the people against monopoly capitalism in particular. I mean, I think antitrust is an under-discussed issue in American politics. We have a situation now where if AI frontier models are going to be the most important platforms for innovation, there are really only about 5 companies in the world that have the money and the scale to make these models. And if all of the rest of our work is going to be downstream of one or other of these frontier models, that's a huge kind of enclosure of cognitive labor and of a kind of commons, really. I guess I'm a product of the early internet and the sort of dream of an open information society and an information commons which belonged to everybody and could be added to and used freely. And instead, what we have found with the platform capitalist model, and which is being accelerated by AI, is that this sort of openness is being superseded by something much more dirigiste and top-down, even if it doesn't look like a kind of 20th century top-down control.
Something that maybe not merely is a monopoly, but is a monopoly that is a complete black box and nobody can actually understand what is happening within it.
Absolutely. And, if we're all enmeshed in some kind of matrix that's, I don't mean it in the sort of movie term, I mean based, or using a substrate, let's say, of an algorithmic substrate whose contours are not completely visible to us and that produces the news we see, that produces the information that we use, that regulates our conceptual thinking about things. I mean, there's enormous dangers in that.
Yeah. When you are thinking, this is my final question to you, when you are thinking about the coming Trump presidency and talking about coastal elites and what we've just talked about cultural understanding and technology, what do you think your role will be in that coming world, the role of culture and the arts in the upcoming years?
Well, I think the role of the artist as somebody who thinks but isn't trying to take power, I mean, that gives you a certain sort of moral authority, perhaps, if you're trying to understand the world, not in order to put yourself at the helm in any way, but just in order to try and elucidate what's happening. That might be useful, I think. Artists, cultural workers imagine things otherwise. That's certainly one of the foundational things that we're supposed to do. The sort of autonomist slogan, another world as possible, is actually a statement about epistemology. It's a statement about we could organize things differently, and so how? Personally, I'm somebody who's always been very interested in technology and believes that there are vectors of liberation that new technologies can bring with them. I mean, I think it's undeniable that the internet has been profoundly liberating along certain axes, but at the same time, I also have a deep investment in kinds of culture and kinds of let's say communitarian thinking that are not congenial to some of the sort of Silicon Valley ideologues. So I'm hoping to, perhaps in my usual way, to be slightly aslant of the whole thing, and to really sort of pay attention to the ways that people on many different sides of these debates actually think and conduct themselves, and try and kind of work out as best I can what's going on and try and share that with others. If that's a useful role, and I hope it is, then that's the one I can intend to play.
Hari Kunzru, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
This has been The Lead from New Lines Magazine. You can find Hari Kunzru on Twitter at Hari Kunzru. His latest novel, Blue Ruin, is available to buy now online and in all good bookstores. Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, with a new introduction by Hari, will be re-released by Penguin later this month. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.